There are certain long, empty stretches of highway in Nevada that I make a conscious effort to avoid now. Not because of traffic conditions or poor road maintenance, and not even because of anything I could reasonably report or prove, but rather because of something that happened to me one night in late October of 2021. An experience that, even now, feels just as strange and disquieting as it did in the moment, and one that left a lasting impression I've never quite managed to shake, no matter how many times I try to rationalize it away. I had made the decision to drive from Reno to Las Vegas overnight, choosing to take the long, desolate stretch of US Route 95 that cuts through some of the most barren and lifeless terrain in the state. And I set out a little after 9 in the evening, armed with a full tank of gas, a playlist of quiet background music, a few energy drinks tucked beside the passenger seat, and the intention of getting to my destination by morning without having to stop for much along the way. The road, as expected, was almost entirely empty, and for the first 40 or so minutes, I passed through the usual silence and darkness that settles in once you leave the city limits behind. No streetlights, no neighboring cars, just the soft glow of my dashboard gauges and the steady reach of my high beams stretching out in front of me across the smooth blacktop. It was somewhere outside the town of Fallon, with nothing but the flat desert and occasional patches of distant brush on either side of the road, that I first noticed a set of headlights appear in my rearview mirror. Not abruptly, not speeding up to catch me, but gradually, like someone had merged onto the highway several miles back and was now quietly closing the distance. At first, I didn't give the appearance of that vehicle any real thought, as it's not uncommon, even on remote stretches like that one, for another driver to appear now and then, especially late at night when truckers or long-distance travelers make their way between towns. What struck me as unusual, and what slowly began to unsettle me, was not the fact that the vehicle was following behind me, but rather the way it maintained its position with unnatural consistency, never veering too close, never falling back, never making any effort to pass, as though the driver had no destination of their own, but simply intended to remain behind me for as long as I kept moving forward. Out of a mixture of curiosity and unease, I adjusted my speed slightly, not enough to draw attention to the change, but enough to see if it would prompt the other driver to respond. And I immediately noticed that every subtle increase or decrease in my own velocity was matched precisely by the car behind me, not just roughly, but with uncanny accuracy, as if it were tethered to my bumper by some invisible thread. I slowed down to well below the speed limit, expecting that this would prompt the driver to overtake me and continue on their way, but instead, they also reduced their speed and maintained the exact same distance, never veering to one side, never drifting into another lane, and never giving the impression that they were impatient or in a hurry. They simply followed, deliberately and silently, mile after mile, without ever breaking that fixed interval between us. For a while, I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that perhaps the driver behind me felt uneasy traveling alone through the desert in the dead of night and had decided to pace their drive with mine, using the presence of my headlights as some kind of mental anchor to make the trip feel less isolating. Still, as the minutes dragged on and the road remained empty and unchanging, I found that my unease began to outpace my reasoning, and I could no longer ignore the fact that this wasn't a case of incidental proximity. It was something intentional, something methodical, something that didn't feel casual or spontaneous. I took the first exit I could find, a small 2-lane ramp that led toward a quiet town I barely remembered from earlier trips, hoping that if I left the main road and made a few unnecessary turns through the side streets, I might confirm whether this vehicle really was trailing me on purpose. To my growing discomfort, the car followed me down the off-ramp without hesitation. And as I turned onto a small road flanked by darkened buildings and blinking intersections, it mirrored every movement with the same quiet precision, never faltering, never seeming unsure of where I was going. As though the driver behind me already knew the route I was taking, even though I hadn't known it myself a few seconds earlier. I looped the block twice, turning at random and slowing to a crawl, trying to throw off any illusion of pattern. But the trailing vehicle never hesitated, never paused at a stop sign, never showed any indication that they were lost or looking for directions. They simply followed, calmly and consistently, matching each turn and change in direction with such measured timing that it began to feel less like I was being followed by another human being, and more like I was being shadowed by something entirely mechanical or programmed. Eventually, I turned back onto the highway, not because I felt safe, but because I didn't know what else to do. And once I merged into the southbound lane, the headlights reappeared behind me in the mirror, exactly where they had been before, as though none of the detour had happened, as though the car and its driver had been waiting for me to return to the main road all along. I drove in silence for the next hour, unable to bring myself to listen to music or turn on the radio, focusing instead on the constant presence of those headlights behind me, which never once deviated, dimmed, or moved out of position. A quiet but relentless presence that felt less like another traveler and more like a shadow I could not escape. The farther I drove, the more I became aware of how profoundly alone I was in that part of the state. With no cell reception, no towns within visible range, no gas stations or motels glowing in the distance. Just a two-lane highway slicing through an ocean of blackness. The desert stretching out in every direction like a great hollow silence, waiting to swallow me up. I thought briefly about pulling over, about stopping the car and getting out, maybe even confronting whoever was behind the wheel. But something deep in my gut warned me not to. Not because I feared immediate danger, but because there was something about their patience, their consistency, their refusal to engage, that told me whatever they wanted, they would only act on it if I gave them the right opportunity. Eventually, after what felt like nearly an hour and a half of quiet tension and that relentless presence behind me, I began to see the faint, scattered glow of electric lights on the horizon. A soft bloom in the distance that grew brighter with each passing mile, until I realized I was approaching one of the larger highway rest stops just north of Tonopah. The kind with rows of semi-trucks idling under the glow of high-mounted floodlights. A few vending machines humming near the building entrance, and a small but steady stream of travelers coming and going, enough to feel like a lifeline in the middle of the otherwise empty desert. Without giving any signal or slowing down in advance, I veered onto the exit ramp at the last second, my heart thudding hard as I made the turn, half expecting to see the vehicle behind me swerve to follow or overshoot and vanish past the off-ramp. But when I glanced quickly into the rearview mirror as I reached the lot entrance, there were no headlights trailing me, no approaching silhouette on the road, no sign of movement at all. I pulled into a space near the front of the building, not quite close enough to draw attention from anyone else nearby, but still well within the circle of light cast by the overhead lamps, and killed the engine. For several minutes, I stayed inside the car without moving, my hands still gripping the steering wheel and my eyes fixed on the road beyond the lot entrance, waiting for the vehicle to reappear or come slowly crawling into view, perhaps delayed by a moment of hesitation. But nothing happened. The highway remained empty, and the only motion came from a trucker stepping down from his cab to stretch his legs and a pair of teenagers milling near the vending machines. There was no trace of the vehicle that had followed me so closely and with such unerring precision for so many miles. Eventually, after convincing myself that I couldn't sit there all night, I stepped out of the car, locked the doors by habit, and walked over to the vending area where the light felt harsh but oddly comforting. I bought a bottle of water I didn't particularly need and stood there for a while, sipping slowly and letting the cool plastic settle in my hand while I occasionally glanced out toward the lot and the road beyond it, still expecting something, anything, to appear. But no one came. No other car pulled in. No headlights crested the ramp. After maybe 15 minutes, I got back in the car and sat for a while longer before finally starting the engine and heading south again, finishing the rest of the drive without incident. I never saw that vehicle again, and I never told anyone about it in any official capacity. Not because I didn't want to, but because I had nothing of substance to share. There was no license plate to record, no make or model to identify, and not even the faintest silhouette of the driver's face to hold on to. What I did have, however, was a vivid and persistent memory of a vehicle that moved exactly when I moved, turned exactly where I turned, never once broke formation for nearly 90 uninterrupted miles. And even now, all this time later, I sometimes find myself thinking about that night. Not constantly, not obsessively, but in quiet moments when I'm alone behind the wheel again. Especially on roads where the distance between towns stretches long and thin, and the sky feels too big for how small you suddenly realize you are. I still drive, of course, but I've never taken that exact route again, and I probably never will. Not because of anything that happened in the end, but because of everything that never did. Because whoever was behind me that night seemed content to follow for as long as I kept moving. And because I still wonder, deep down, what might have happened if I had stopped. It was a little after 5 in the morning in early March of 2022 when I found myself driving alone along US Route 2, heading east through the quiet and unbroken sprawl of northern Montana, where the sky still held the weight of night, and the fields on either side of the 2-lane highway were wrapped in darkness so complete that even the low hum of my engine seemed swallowed by the vast emptiness surrounding me. I had left the motel on the outskirts of Shelby before sunrise, hoping to make it to Glasgow by mid-morning without losing time to traffic or weather. Although out there, across that empty high plains country, neither tended to be much of an issue unless you were unlucky enough to run into a storm system rolling down from the Canadian border. I had taken this route more times than I could remember, often alone and often at this exact hour. And I had come to associate these long stretches of empty road with a strange kind of peace. A peace that settled in my chest somewhere between mile markers and had very little to do with comfort, but everything to do with solitude and the quiet ritual of passing mile after mile, without conversation, without interruption, and without the sense that anything unexpected could possibly happen in a place that looked exactly the same, no matter how many hours passed. The highway was empty when I started out, with nothing but the static-laced drone of the radio low in the background, and a travel mug of lukewarm coffee resting in the center console, the lid barely holding on after too many refills over too many long drives. It was only when I'd been driving for about 30 or maybe 35 minutes that I first noticed the soft glow of headlights in my rearview mirror. 2 pale orbs of light in the distance, steady and low against the flat horizon, hovering at a comfortable distance that didn't immediately strike me as odd. At the time, I assumed it was another driver making their way across the same route, someone like me trying to eat up miles before the day began in earnest. And for a while, I thought little of it, letting the presence of the vehicle behind me become part of the landscape, no different than the passing fence posts or the slow rise and fall of shallow hills in the dark beyond the reach of my headlights. What began to unsettle me, though I didn't immediately acknowledge it, was how little that distance between us changed. Because no matter how far I drove or how long I stayed at the same pace, the vehicle behind me never grew closer and never fell back, maintaining a fixed distance so exact that it eventually stopped feeling like coincidence and started to gnaw at the back of my mind with the vague and persistent discomfort of something that was acting deliberately, too precisely to be the result of chance or casual inattention. I found myself glancing into the mirror more frequently, not out of fear exactly, but with that instinctive kind of alertness that creeps in slowly when something doesn't quite make sense. And I began to realize that for all the time the lights had been behind me, certainly 10 minutes by then, possibly closer to 12, I had never once seen the vehicle itself, only those two unwavering headlights glowing like static points suspended in the dark, without the usual motion or vibration that headlights tend to have on rough road or with wind pressure, and without any indication of whether it was a sedan, a pickup truck, a commercial van, or anything else for that matter. There were no other cars, no intersections, and not a single exit or pull-off along that stretch of road, which made it all the more unusual that the other vehicle never attempted to pass, never drifted in the lane, and never exhibited the kind of small, human inconsistencies I had come to expect from long-haul drivers. Nothing that suggested fatigue or boredom, or even the impulse to close the distance, just to break the monotony of the drive. Instead, it simply remained there, suspended behind me in perfect alignment, never gaining, never vanishing, until, in a span of less than 2 seconds, it did. I had looked down, just briefly, to adjust the volume on the radio. And when I raised my eyes again to the mirror, the headlights were no longer there, not faded into the distance, not blinked off like someone cutting their beams, but simply and completely gone, as if they had never existed in the first place. My immediate reaction was confusion rather than fear, and I slowed the car without braking suddenly, easing my foot off the accelerator as I scanned the mirror again, then turned slightly to glance over my shoulder through the rear window, expecting to see some curve in the road I had forgotten, some dip in the terrain that might have hidden the vehicle momentarily. But all I saw was the same uninterrupted ribbon of highway stretching out behind me beneath the soft sheen of frost, vanishing eventually into the faraway horizon where the land and sky dissolved into each other without contrast or detail. Still unsure of what I'd just seen or failed to see, I pulled off onto the shoulder, stopping the car completely and allowing the engine to idle as I sat there in the driver's seat, squinting out into the darkness behind me, hoping that if I waited long enough, the lights would reappear, and this strange moment would explain itself in some mundane way, like a sharp turn or a gravel path I had simply failed to notice while distracted. But there was nothing out there. No road veering off to the side, no elevation change, no fence break, no sign of a vehicle parked or moving or even stopped in the distance. And the longer I sat there, the more impossible it became to believe that anything had turned around or pulled off without being seen. When I eventually eased the car back onto the road and resumed driving, I found myself glancing at the rearview mirror far more frequently than usual, each time half expecting those headlights to return, and each time telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation, something mechanical, environmental, or just plain human that I had missed in the moment. But no matter how I turned it over in my head during the rest of that drive, I kept coming back to the same question. If there had been nowhere for the vehicle to go, and no place for it to disappear to, then why hadn't I seen it again? Later that evening, once I had reached my destination and finally had a moment to catch my breath, I decided to go ahead and transfer the dashcam footage from the drive to my laptop. Not because I thought it would prove anything one way or another, but mostly because I just wanted to see if what I remembered actually lined up with what the camera had captured. I figured maybe it would show something I'd missed, or maybe it would look less strange in hindsight. What I saw, though, didn't make anything easier to explain. The footage showed exactly what I remembered. The straight, empty stretch of highway laid out in front of me. The quiet rhythm of fence posts slipping by in the dark, and the unmistakable glow of headlights behind me. First faint, then steady, and then perfectly fixed in the rear-facing camera frame for just over 11 minutes. The lights never drifted, never swayed, and never broke formation the way real headlights typically do on uneven pavement. They remained exactly where they were, as if suspended in space. Then, just like that, gone. One frame they were there, the next they weren't. No fade, no turning arc, no distance gained or lost. Just gone, as if the vehicle had been erased cleanly from the footage itself. I ran through the video multiple times, slowing it down, boosting the brightness, checking for reflections or glares or any flicker that might hint at a more mundane answer. I even shared it with a friend of mine who had worked as a highway patrol officer for years and had seen more than his share of strange footage from dash cams. He looked it over with a critical eye, suggesting a few things that made sense on paper. Light refraction from moisture on the lens, mirage effects from heat differentials in the road surface, or even the unlikely possibility of someone using blackout gear and pulling off in total darkness. But none of those suggestions really held up when measured against the consistency and clarity of what had been recorded. He admitted, eventually, that he didn't know what to make of it either. And though neither of us tried to dress it up as anything supernatural, the conversation ended with the same quiet shrug it started with. Sometimes things happen out on the road that don't add up as neatly as we'd like. Since that morning, I haven't had another experience quite like it. I've driven that same road again more times than I can count. And while it's remained as empty and uneventful as always, I still catch myself looking in the mirror more than I used to. Especially in the early hours, when the sky is still black and the only light for miles comes from your own headlights and whatever follows behind you. I don't expect to see anything, but I remember what it felt like the one time I did. And it's not the presence that stays with me. It's how completely it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. It was sometime in the early spring of 2018 when I found myself making the long, solitary drive north from Phoenix to Flagstaff. A route I had taken more times than I could count, yet one that always managed to feel a little lonelier and more hollow when traveled after midnight, when the desert stretched out endlessly in all directions, cloaked in darkness and silence, with nothing but the low, steady hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional distant glimmer of headlights from oncoming traffic to remind me that I wasn't the only one moving through that vast, sleeping landscape. I had been driving for hours, lulled into a sort of focused trance by the monotony of the road and the rhythmic sound of the engine. And though I wasn't particularly tired, I felt the creeping discomfort of a full bladder and the stiffness of sitting in the same position for too long. So when I saw the familiar green reflective sign indicating a rest stop ahead, I eased off the gas and took the exit without a second thought, expecting nothing more than a quick stop under harsh fluorescent lights before returning to the comfort of the road. As I pulled into the rest area, I immediately noticed how still and vacant everything appeared, with not a single other vehicle parked in the lot. Not even a long-haul truck idling in a far-off corner or a lone car with its interior light glowing, which struck me as unusual but not alarming at first, since it was well past 1 in the morning and these rural stops were often deserted at this hour. Still, there was something oddly sterile about the scene, as though the place wasn't just empty, but abandoned in a way that didn't quite fit the time or setting. And that vague sense of disquiet began to take root before I had even opened my door. I stepped out of the car into the cool desert air, which was crisp and dry in that early spring way that makes every sound seem sharper than it should be, and I began walking toward the restroom building, guided by the flickering yellowish glow of overhead sodium lamps that cast long, distorted shadows on the cracked pavement and gave everything an artificial, almost stage-lit appearance that seemed to exaggerate even the most mundane details. It was as I neared the building that I first noticed the two men, not through movement or sound, but through presence alone, as they stood there in the periphery of the lit area, each of them positioned in a way that immediately unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite articulate at the time, though the memory of their arrangement has stayed with me ever since. One of the men was standing with his back against the outer wall of the restroom facility, motionless and unnervingly rigid, as though he had been placed there deliberately, not leaning casually or appearing to wait for someone, but simply holding position like a fixture, his posture tight and unnatural, his face obscured by the downward angle of the lights overhead, giving him the look of a statue, just slightly misaligned with reality. The second man was more difficult to make out, not because of distance, but because of how he had chosen to position himself. Tucked partially behind the edge of the building itself, barely visible in the fragmented line between shadow and light, with only the faintest glint of an eye or edge of a silhouette betraying his presence. And the very fact that he had taken care not to be entirely seen made me all the more aware of his intent, whatever that intent might have been. What struck me most, however, was not merely their positioning or their silence, but the complete lack of acknowledgement as I approached, as though my presence did not register with them at all, or, more disturbingly, as though they were entirely aware of me, but had no reason to pretend otherwise. And in that moment, I felt a sharp, visceral awareness of just how isolated I truly was, standing there under artificial lights in the middle of the Arizona desert, with no one else around for what could have easily been miles. I paused a good 20 feet away from the entrance to the restroom, not wanting to get closer, and studied them as discreetly as I could, hoping for any signal of harmlessness. A glance, a shift in body language, a casual movement that would reframe the scene as merely coincidental. But none came, and the longer I stood there, the more convinced I became that their presence wasn't incidental at all, but intentional, and possibly even coordinated, though I had no idea what for. I considered briefly whether I was simply overthinking the situation. Perhaps they were travelers like me. Perhaps they were waiting for someone or resting in an odd way. Perhaps this entire scenario was being colored by the late hour, and the natural tension that builds after driving alone for too long. But that rational voice was quickly drowned out by something far older and more instinctive. A kind of ancestral warning that rose up from my gut and tightened around my spine, telling me, without words, that I should not be standing there. That the only smart decision was to turn around and leave before whatever had not yet happened finally did. Without making a sound, without looking directly at either of them, I pivoted slowly, walked back to my car with deliberate, measured steps, trying not to show the urgency building inside me. And once I was safely behind the wheel with the doors locked, I turned the key, reversed, and pulled back onto the highway with an almost feral relief. As if I had narrowly escaped stepping into something irreversible. The rest of the drive to Flagstaff was uneventful on the surface, but my mind refused to quiet down. It kept circling back to the image of those two men, the way they had stood there like shadows with shape, their silence and stillness more threatening than any words or weapons could have been. And the growing certainty that I had interrupted something, or worse, arrived just in time to become part of it. It wasn't until several weeks later, during a casual scroll through a local news outlet's website, that I saw a brief mention that the same rest stop had been temporarily closed by state officials, with the explanation citing concerns about vandalism and public safety, though no further details were given. No suspects named and no reports of arrests or follow-up investigations, which, if anything, only deepened my unease and confirmed for me that whatever was going on there that night, it wasn't just in my head. I've never stopped to wonder what might have happened if I had ignored the feeling and gone into that restroom anyway, or if I had spoken to the men and tried to push past the tension in search of some benign explanation. Because the truth is, I don't want to know what would have happened if I had stepped closer instead of walking away. And I have no doubt that something about the outcome of that night would have been very different, and possibly very final. There was no dramatic conclusion, no confrontation, no police lights or headlines. Just a quiet decision made in a moment of instinct and the lingering sense that I'd come close to something I will never fully understand. And while part of me still wonders, even now, what exactly I saw that night, a much larger part is grateful that I didn't wait around to find out. It was in the final days of October in 2019. One of those quiet weekday afternoons where the rain doesn't fall in any aggressive way, but rather settles into a cold mist that hangs in the air like a damp curtain. When I found myself driving west along the Pennsylvania Turnpike, returning from a job just outside Mechanicsburg. The road was familiar to me, a stretch I had driven countless times before, but on that particular day, something about it felt unusually still, as though the trees that lined the median had leaned in slightly closer, and the sound of the tires on wet asphalt seemed to soften under the weight of the low gray sky. The sun had already begun its descent behind the ridge, and what little light remained was drained of color, leaving everything washed in a pale, dull glow. It was just past mile marker 242, not far beyond a long, gradual bend in the road, when I first noticed the vehicle pulled off into the breakdown lane. A dark blue, or perhaps black pickup truck, older in style but still solid, sitting at a slight angle as though it had come to a stop without much precision, with its rear end drifted just a few inches closer to the guardrail than the front. At first, I assumed there must have been a mechanical issue, maybe a flat tire or a coolant leak. But as I approached, I realized there were no signs of visible trouble. No popped hood, no steam, no hazard lights blinking in the rain. Beside the truck stood a man, tall in stature and dressed in a long rain jacket that appeared to be made of that heavy vinyl material. The kind that glistens faintly when damp, with the hood pulled up just enough to shadow his face without obscuring the basic outline of his features. He was positioned parallel to the road, standing close to the truck but not leaning on it or interacting with it in any noticeable way. And in both of his hands, held low, with a sort of limp, passive grip, was a pair of jumper cables, their rubber-coated wires dangling toward the wet pavement like roots searching for ground. What struck me more than anything was his complete lack of movement. He wasn't pacing nervously the way people sometimes do when stranded on the highway. Nor was he peering into the engine bay or scrolling through a phone to call for help. In fact, he wasn't doing anything at all. And that was precisely what made the scene so deeply unsettling. He simply stood there in the soft drizzle, expression unreadable, arms at his sides as though he had pulled the cables from the truck and then, for some reason, lost the will or intention to use them. As I passed, I slowed slightly, just enough to observe, but not so much that I gave any indication of stopping. And in that brief window of time, I felt a strange hesitation ripple through my chest. Not fear exactly, but the kind of instinctive discomfort that arises when the details of a situation refuse to align in a sensible way. I remember glancing into my rearview mirror for another look, hoping maybe he would lift his arm or turn away or even take a step. Anything to suggest that he was grounded in the normal world I expected to be driving through. But he didn't move at all. And after a moment, the mist and the curve of the road swallowed him from view. At the next rest area, I briefly considered mentioning what I'd seen to someone. To a state trooper if one happened to be nearby, or even to a clerk at the counter, just in case the man really was in trouble. But the more I replayed it in my mind, the harder it became to articulate exactly what it was that had felt so wrong. It wasn't that he looked injured or dangerous or mentally unstable. He didn't. He just didn't look like someone who was present. And I told myself, somewhat unconvincingly, that perhaps I had misread the situation entirely, that the rain had distorted my perception, or that the strange angle of the truck had given the whole scene an unintended tension. But about 2 weeks later, on another late afternoon drive under nearly identical weather, a low gray sky pressed down over the ridgeline in the kind of steady drizzle that softens everything into silence. I saw him again. I was once more westbound on the turnpike, nearing that familiar curve past mile 242, when the scene unfolded almost exactly as it had before. The same pickup truck sitting crooked in the breakdown lane, rain pooling around its tires, no hazard lights flashing, no visible sign of mechanical trouble. And next to it stood the same figure, still cloaked in that dark rain-slick coat, hood up, his face lost in shadow. The cables were in his hands again, hanging low at his sides just like before. The posture unchanged, the stillness total. It wasn't similar, it was identical. In that moment, as I passed by, a deep, steady tension bloomed in my chest, not like fear exactly, but a strange, involuntary recognition that whatever I was seeing wasn't playing by the rules of coincidence. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. Something inside me had already decided that seeing him once was strange, but seeing him twice meant I no longer understood what I was looking at. That uncertainty felt heavier than any threat. Later that night, alone in a roadside motel just outside Bedford, I couldn't shake the feeling. I sat on the edge of the bed with my phone in hand, scrolling in the dim light. typing in whatever search phrases came to mind. Things like the guy holding jumper cables, Pennsylvania Turnpike, or same truck, stranded rain, same spot. I wasn't expecting answers. I just wanted to know if anyone else had noticed him. And slowly, buried in forums and obscure posts, I started finding fragments. Not articles or news stories, but scattered mentions from other drivers over the years. People describing nearly the same thing. A man standing alone in the rain beside a parked truck, motionless, always near the same stretch of a highway. Some said he'd been there years before. Others wrote about passing him more than once. A few claimed they had tried to stop, only to find nothing there when they turned around. One comment mentioned that there were no tire marks in the shoulder mud. Another said their dash cam glitched right when they passed him, like something had interfered with the recording at just the wrong moment. I didn't know what to make of all that. None of it explained anything. And honestly, it didn't feel like it was supposed to. After that night, I stopped taking that route whenever I could. Not because I was afraid of seeing him again, but because I realized there was nothing useful to be gained from trying to explain what I'd already seen. It was one of those rare moments in life where logic seems to step aside and leave you in a kind of quiet, unresolved understanding that some things just exist outside the edges of reason. I never saw him again. Not in the years that followed. Not on return trips through Pennsylvania. Not in any other state. But whenever I find myself driving in bad weather, especially when the sky turns that specific colorless gray and the road is empty enough to feel hollow, I still catch myself glancing at the shoulder. Not out of habit, but because a small, persistent part of me still half expects to see him standing there, exactly as he was, waiting beside that truck, holding those jumper cables, unmoved by time or weather or logic. And every time I don't see him, which is most of the time, I'm left with a strange mixture of relief and something harder to define. Something like the feeling of a question that never earned an answer. It was during the final weekend of October in 2020, just as the last of the leaves had turned brittle and orange, and the temperature had begun its slow descent into winter, when I found myself driving alone through a particularly remote stretch of a highway that twisted its way through the mountains of West Virginia. I had left a friend's house much later than I intended, and instead of retracing the well-lit interstate I was more familiar with, I trusted the GPS to guide me home by the shortest route, which in this case happened to be an old state road that threaded its way through forgotten hills, valleys, and wooded hollows that hadn't seen regular traffic in years. The night had grown darker than I expected, and as I climbed deeper into the forested elevation, I became aware of just how completely cut off I was from anything resembling civilization. No gas stations, no porch lights, no glowing signs, not even the faint glow of distant farmhouses through the trees. The road was narrow and uneven in places, and the farther I drove, the more the forest on either side seemed to creep closer, with branches arching above me and creating a tunnel effect that left little room for the sky. Fog had started to gather in the low places between hills, settling across the asphalt in thick, cold drifts that moved sluggishly with the wind. And although my heater was running, there was a persistent chill in the cabin that I couldn't quite shake. One that felt more psychological than physical. I hadn't seen another car in more than an hour by that point. And while I wasn't exactly tired, I'd started to fall into that peculiar mental state that comes from too much time alone behind the wheel in darkness. A drifting sense of unreality where the road feels infinite and time loses its weight. It was along one of those long, unbroken curves, where the trees momentarily pulled back just far enough to allow my headlights to reach a little deeper into the night, that I first became aware of something standing near the edge of the road and ahead of me. Something pale and still, positioned several hundred feet in front of me, just beyond the bend. At first, I couldn't make sense of it. It was too upright to be a fallen branch or roadside debris, and the shape didn't match any roadside post or marker I was familiar with. I instinctively eased my foot off the gas, allowing the car to coast forward more slowly as the figure became clearer, and what I had initially mistaken for a reflection or some kind of discarded object revealed itself, unmistakably, to be a person. A woman, standing alone on the right-hand side of the road, not on the shoulder, but just far enough into the gravel to avoid the lane itself, her body unnervingly motionless in the sweep of my headlights. She was barefoot, with her feet planted directly on the cold, damp ground, as though the chill of the pavement meant nothing to her. And she wore what appeared to be a faded hospital gown that hung loosely from her shoulders and reached down to just above her knees, the thin fabric barely moving in the breeze and absorbing the light from my car in a way that made it look almost gray rather than white. Her hair was long, dark, and tangled, hanging unevenly down either side of her face and over her collarbone, and her arms remained at her sides, fingers curled in the kind of loose, lifeless way that made it difficult to tell whether she was exhausted, drugged, or simply very still. She wasn't signaling for help or stepping forward as though to flag me down. In fact, she gave no indication at all that she was aware of my presence, maintaining a slightly hunched, angled stance that made her appear more like someone who had wandered off the path and lost her purpose than someone actively seeking aid. I continued to slow as I approached, not because I had made a conscious decision to stop, but because every instinct I had was demanding more time to process what I was looking at. The scene felt fundamentally wrong, not dangerous in the way of a threat, but wrong in the quiet, subtle way that makes the hairs on the back of your neck rise before your thoughts catch up with your senses. As my vehicle drew parallel with her, I watched her begin to turn her head, not quickly or abruptly, but with an unnatural slowness, as though she were responding to something she had heard only faintly from a great distance. Her face, now partially visible in the high beam's periphery, was pale and angular, not disfigured or visibly injured, but strangely vacant, her features devoid of tension, recognition, or urgency. She made no attempt to speak, no motion to reach out or approach the vehicle. She merely looked toward me with a stillness that did not resemble fear or confusion, but rather a kind of detached awareness, like someone who was watching a film of her own life from the outside. Before I had the chance to stop or speak or even fully react, she began walking. Not toward the car, not along the road, but directly back into the forest, stepping calmly into the undergrowth with the same unhurried, soundless movements that had made her turn so disturbing. She didn't hesitate at the tree line, didn't look back, and didn't seem to be searching for a path or reacting to the terrain beneath her bare feet. It was as though she had already walked that exact route 1,000 times and knew it by heart. Within seconds, she had disappeared between the trees, her form swallowed entirely by the density of the woods and the shadows beyond the reach of my lights. I drove forward another minute or so before I allowed myself to pull over, finding a patch of gravel barely wide enough to get my tires off the road. I didn't reverse, didn't attempt to turn around, and I certainly didn't step out of the vehicle. I simply sat there, gripping the wheel, listening to the muted hum of the engine and the whisper of wind outside the glass. trying to convince myself that what I had seen had a rational explanation. Some injured hiker, perhaps, or someone who had wandered away from a nearby medical facility. Though I couldn't imagine where such a facility would even be in that part of the state. There had been no lights, no fences, no signs of habitation for miles. I sat there for several minutes, unable to shake the feeling that I had just witnessed something important, though I could not say what, and that my inaction, my decision to simply keep driving, had left something unresolved behind me in the trees. When I finally pulled away from the spot where I'd stopped, the stretch of road ahead felt longer than I remembered, as if the landscape had subtly changed in the time I'd spent sitting there, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The drive to the next town felt unusually quiet, not in the sense of silence, but in the sense of being sealed off from the rest of the world, like I was moving through something separate from the normal rhythm of a night travel. By the time I reached the first lit intersection in miles, the kind with a single blinking yellow light and a shuttered gas station on the corner, I found myself sitting through an empty green light simply because I wasn't ready to keep going. I stayed in the car for a few more minutes after parking near a convenience store, unsure whether I was more disturbed by what I had seen or by how quickly the rest of the world seemed to return to normal once I'd left that stretch of road behind. I didn't talk about it when I got home. Not that night anyway. It wasn't the kind of story you casually bring up. I wasn't even sure what I'd say or how it would sound coming out of my mouth. The next morning, after a few hours of restless sleep and a persistent feeling that I'd missed something important, I looked up the sheriff's department for the county I'd been driving through and called their non-emergency line. I gave them my name, explained what I'd seen, and offered the time and location as best I could. I expected the usual brush off, maybe a polite note that they'd keep an eye out. But the deputy who took the call didn't seem surprised. His voice didn't change when I described the woman's gown, or the way she turned her head without speaking. He asked me to repeat a few details, then told me, very matter-of-factly, that I wasn't the first person to report something like that. Apparently, over the past year or so, several drivers had called in with similar accounts. Always late at night, always along the same stretch of road, and always describing a lone woman in a hospital gown, barefoot, unresponsive, and vanishing into the woods before anyone could stop. He didn't offer any theories, and he didn't sound like he was entertaining one either. There had been a few informal searches early on, he told me, especially after the second or third call came in, but nothing was ever found. No footprints, no personal items, no trace of someone living off-grid. There were no missing persons cases that matched the description, no patients unaccounted for from local facilities, no suspicious activity that would point to a crime. The reports had continued, but the response had settled into a quiet routine. Listen, log the call, and move on. I thanked him and hung up, unsure what I was supposed to feel. I hadn't imagined her. Other people had seen her too. That should have brought some comfort, but instead it left me with a deeper kind of discomfort. The kind that comes from knowing something real is happening, but no one knows what to do about it. Or worse, that people have quietly accepted it as something that just happens and doesn't get explained. I don't think about her constantly, and I wouldn't go so far as to say the experience changed my life. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, especially in areas that feel isolated or too quiet, I find myself watching the tree line a little more closely than before, expecting nothing, but remembering everything. And if I ever saw her again, standing exactly as she had, barefoot on the shoulder, eyes just slightly too empty for the scene to feel right. I honestly don't know if I'd stop. Maybe I would. Maybe I wouldn't. And maybe that uncertainty says more than I want it to.